Hospital stays are often dismal, especially if the attending physician carefully pretends that everything is fine, speaks in a deliberately loud, cheerful voice, and at the same time averts his eyes, coughs embarrassed, and rubs the stethoscope hanging around his neck. Norman had long since given up, expecting anything positive from either the weather or his physician. That year, winter was notably harsh, with relentless snowstorms causing the hospital windows to shudder throughout the night. The city was blanketed by low grey clouds that seemed to weigh down everything, obscuring the sun and the blue sky. Despite the freezing temperatures outside, the hospital wards were excessively heated, making the air stuffy and seemingly shimmer before one's eyes. This was Norman's first hospital stay in nearly 35 years. Like anyone else, he had suffered from viral infections, weathered common colds, and even sustained a few fractures. However, he had always recuperated at home, seldom taking time off work. Admitted to this medical institution, he quickly found himself overwhelmed by boredom. He, a very active person who had never sat still for more than a few minutes since childhood, could not bear complete inactivity. On the one hand, he was terribly sorry for time, and on the other hand, it was painful to watch how slowly the minutes, hours, and days dragged on. He was hospitalized for acute pneumonia, which his mother attributed to self-medication. A sudden fever led him to seek relief in an advertised powder. However, within a few days, he was suffering from a severe cough. Suddenly came a terrible weakness, headache, chills. In general, such a bouquet of troubles that even he, always ignoring health problems, was a little scared. He was going to be cured in a few days, but all he achieved was that the temperature rose to an extremely high 40 degrees Celsius, and his friend, who came to visit the sick man, saw his almost dead pallor and drops of sweat on his forehead and took him to the hospital. Recovering from the initial shock of his sudden hospitalization, Norman tried to adjust to the discomfort of his hospital bed. He sought advice on the internet, where experts assured him he would recover within 1.5 to 2 weeks. However, they also warned of rare exceptions. After 2 weeks in the hospital, it became clear that his case was an exception. "You see, Norman, you have a type of pneumonia we refer to as long-term. The pneumonic infiltrate in your lungs is resolving extremely slowly. Therefore, you'll need to stay with us for at least 4 more weeks," the doctor explained. To Norman, the doctor's words sounded like a funeral march. He felt as though he wasn't going to die from pneumonia, but from boredom and immobility. His mood worsened because he was in a separate single room. Initially it seemed like a privilege upon admission, but now it felt like punishment. He listened enviously to the constant hum of conversations from the neighbouring wards, with their doors open. Finally, he asked, "Doctor, can I be moved to the general ward?" The on-call doctor looked at Norman confused and shook his head. "The ward is full. There's not a single spot available. Plus, in your condition, it's not advisable to be around others. You could catch something else, which wouldn't be good," he replied. Norman lay there, angry at himself and the world. His mood worsened each day, even though it seemed impossible to get any worse from the day before. It was as if his body was stuck midway between illness and recovery, unwilling to move forward. Many people encounter significant turning points, moments after which life, as they've known it, filled with familiar people, events, actions and thoughts, remains behind. Norman was experiencing such a moment just right now. Suddenly, his worries, irritations and anxieties seemed trivial and incredibly insignificant. The only thing that mattered now was his future, which he had always taken for granted, like the sky, the sun and the seasons, might no longer be a certainty. What should I do? Call my parents? No, that could wait. Why frighten them? Especially since Mum recently suffered a heart attack she hasn't fully recovered from. And if not them, then who? Suddenly, it struck him that he had no one to call. There was no one to share his worries with, no one to offer encouraging words or a supportive gaze. How did I end up here? He thought, the weight of his loneliness momentarily eclipsing the news of his illness. How did I, a healthy, intelligent, independent 33-year-old man, reach a point where I have no one who is truly interested in me? Of course, no one wasn't entirely accurate. Norman had many acquaintances, friends and colleagues. He had business contacts and romantic partners. But these relationships felt superficial, offering him little comfort or sincere empathy. At that moment he felt profoundly alone in the world. Time had become meaningless. He didn't know how long he had lain motionless in his hospital bed. Clearly it was long enough for the room to darken considerably. Suddenly, a rectangle of light illuminated the dark floor, casting a small shadow, too low to belong to an adult. "Well," Norman grinned, "I've started hallucinating a bit early." He blinked several times, surprised to see a figure standing before him when his vision cleared. A girl, about 4 years old, stood there. She had what many would describe as an angelic appearance. A rosy face, round cheeks, large grey eyes, and light blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends, cascading almost to the shoulders. "Are you sick?" she asked, peering at Norman with large grey eyes. "Sick," Norman nodded in agreement. "Sick?" The girl was clearly intent on understanding the situation. "Quite so," Norman replied. "They say I might even die." "No, you won't," said the girl. "And how do you know?" Norman knew his conversation with this child, who had appeared from nowhere, was pointless and nonsensical, but he couldn't stop. "I just know," she replied. "I always know when someone is going to die." Norman was utterly dumbfounded by her bizarre statement and fell silent. What happened next was something Norman would remember for the rest of his life. The girl walked over to his bed, reached out and placed a small, soft hand onto Norman's, which was lying helplessly on the bed's edge. The warm touch of the tiny creature was like an electric shock. Despite being an experienced adult with 2 higher education degrees, Norman couldn't comprehend what was happening. He didn't want to. He only wanted this feeling to continue. It seemed as though energy, strength, courage, and a will to live were flowing into him. He wasn't scared or alone anymore. He had a tiny angel with him. His angel. "Who are you?" Norman whispered. The little girl eyed the man shyly, sniffed in her characteristic way, and then wiped her nose with her sleeve. "Do you have anything tasty here?" It was a typical question from an ordinary child. "Tasty?" the man asked, confused. "I probably don't have anything." "Nothing at all?" The grey-eyed cherub glanced at him disapprovingly, then at the large golden orange on the bedside table. "Oh, I completely forgot," Norman remembered. "Here, take this." The little girl extended her hand, took the orange, and suddenly turned towards the door. Her hand, clutching the orange, immediately hid behind her back. A woman was standing at the threshold. "Emily, there you are," a soft voice echoed. "I've been looking all over for you. Who allowed you to leave the room, you little rascal?" Emily. So it's the girl's name, the man thought to himself, shifting his gaze to the woman in the blue medical suit. Until now, Norman's life had been relatively peaceful. Sure, there were troubles and joys, partings and reunions, ups and downs, but he took it all in his stride, understanding what was happening. However, the events of this strange day were hitting him one after another, leaving him no time to make sense of it all. He recognized the young woman standing at the threshold of his room. He knew her very well, for she was the only woman he had ever loved and lost. It was Lindsay. From an early age, Norman had lived by the motto, faster, higher, stronger. However, these principles were realized not in sports, as one might assume, but in his family, where he was the third youngest son. His mother, Mary, was a determined woman who, despite having achieved much, continued to assert her superiority. All of Mary's possessions fit into a small bag, and all the more or less decent clothes she had on. But her head was filled with grand plans, and she threw herself passionately into realizing them. On her second attempt, she was accepted into the economics faculty. She studied hard and persistently, working night shifts as a saleswoman at a commercial stall, cleaning entrances and covering for janitors. She was a tough, vivacious and somewhat desperate girl who never shied away from any work and was never idle. She lived in a dormitory and didn't socialize with anyone except for Holly, a classmate, who for some unknown reason she chose as her friend. Why should I be friends with people as limited and poor as me? What's the point of such acquaintances? She rationalized her lack of the usual student relationships. Why are you friends with me, then? Her pal jested. Who knows? Mary shrugged. It's just that it's tough to go it alone. A person isn't a wolf. While her friends were debating whether to take offence at this ambiguous compliment, Mary had moved on to another topic, and the issue was dropped. When I have everything a normal person should have, then I'll start making friends, she pragmatically reasoned. She decisively dismissed any guys who were interested in her, making it clear she wasn't interested in casual suitors. Before her final year, Mary, who was very handy, joined a team of craftsmen who repaired apartments. This led her into a world she had never dared to dream of. Huge apartments, no less than 100 square feet, with high ceilings, decorative cornices, and rooms with 2 or 3 windows were beyond belief. One day, they were going to repair the next apartment. Well, it's a problem, she heard the foreman's displeased voice when they entered it. We had agreed, but you haven't prepared the apartment and took away your belongings. You haven't closed the furniture, and you've got books lying around. I'm sorry, please, mumbled a young dishevelled fellow in glasses, embarrassed under the foreman's menacing stare. He grabbed several books, looked around helplessly, and tripped over something, dropped them all to the floor with a loud clatter. I completely forgot, you know. My parents are away on holiday, and I've got my exams, and it just slipped my mind. I'll do it right now, he said, yanking up the sheet on the couch. Several items fell from it. Couch cushions, books, keys, and even a bright yellow tennis ball. I see that's not going to be fast, the foreman chuckled ironically. Okay, well, you guys clean it up today, and we'll start the repairs tomorrow. The foreman looked doubtfully at the bespectacled, clumsy young man, who stood in the middle of the room with a sheet in his hands, and said, I'll tell you what. I'll leave you with our Mary. She'll stay here to help you with the preparation so that everything will be ready by tomorrow. So Mary's team left while she, alongside the young man named Weston, began packing books and covering furniture and chandeliers. Together they rolled up the carpets and, exhausted, sat side by side on one of the resulting rolls. Mary, I'm so grateful to you. You can't imagine. The man removed his glasses and looked at her. Up close, his face was boyish and somewhat vulnerable. No, Weston, she smiled warmly, unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her shirt. It's so hot, she declared, fanning herself. I'll be right there. He jumped up hastily, almost knocking over the seated Mary. She clutched his leg with a frightened yelp, casting a casual glance downwards at him. Embarrassed, Weston stumbled over his words. Mary, may I offer you some tea? Or are you hungry? Very much, Mary responded enthusiastically. Half an hour later, the state of things was more or less clear for Mary. Weston was the only son of university professors. His father, a professor in a physics field that Mary had never even heard of, and his mother, an associate professor in another department, impressed her immediately. The key words for her were professor and associate professor, which to Mary sounded like an entryway into a different world. His parents, both scientists, seemed to view their son only through a scientific lens. Weston was the sole heir to the professor's estate, a significant and potentially life-changing opportunity that Mary couldn't afford to miss. As parting, Mary noticed he flinched and blushed at her casual touch. In a languid tone, she said, "Thank you, Weston. You gave me food and drink and pleasant conversation. You know, it means a lot to me. I have no one else in this city." The apartment renovation lasted 10 days. After the workers left each day, Mary stayed behind to clean up the debris, wash the floors, and most importantly, spend time alone with Weston. He attempted to assist, but often just got in the way, dropping garbage bags and blushing intensely. He always offered her dinner and tea, then walked her to the bus stop. On the 7th day of their acquaintance, she was beginning to wonder if she should take a longer time to change from her work uniform into her regular clothes, so that he might see her unintentionally. But then, as though answering her eternal request, he took her hand and said, "Mary, I'm sorry if I seem like an idiot to you. I know this is all happening rapidly, but I really like you." Well, finally, she thought with relief, giving the young man a shy smile. That evening, she didn't return to the dormitory. Instead, she stayed in the professor's apartment. Weston, a timid and inexperienced guy, knew very little about romantic relationships. He had spent almost all of his 26 years engrossed in books and seemed to have never even kissed once. Despite Mary's limited personal life experience, she managed to awaken Weston's affection, making him deeply grateful. As the repairs concluded and they began packing their tools, Weston approached her with panic in his eyes. "Mary, will I never see you again?" "Do you want to see me again?" she asked slyly. "Of course." He hastily removed his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and looked resolutely into her eyes. "I want to see you all the time. I love you." Everything was easier than she had anticipated. When his parents returned from the holiday, Mary was introduced as his beloved girlfriend and bride. She endured a tense family evening, then modestly slipped away, leaving Weston to handle his parents. Weston defended his love vehemently and succeeded. They got married. Although they didn't get the newly renovated professor's apartment, which Mary hadn't really counted on, they settled in a smaller, but still very decent 2-bedroom apartment. 6 months later, solidifying their success and position in the family, Mary became pregnant. If Weston's parents had initially harboured some resentment due to the speed at which their relationship developed, the birth of their son Paul, named after Weston's father, put all doubts to rest. The grandparents were overjoyed with their robust grandson, weighing in at 4 kilograms. Paul was a true giant, unlike any of their scholarly but frail and pale relatives. Over the span of 10 years, Mary had 3 such healthy boys, Paul, Henry, and the youngest, Norman. In the midst of this, she managed to graduate from the college, return to work quickly after her maternity leaves, and secured a significant position in the accounting department of a large factory. She was regarded as strict and dull at her workplace, but her professionalism and quality of work were undeniable. Their marriage with Weston turned out to be surprisingly happy and strong. Even though Mary did not love him at first and married him out of convenience, but she turned out to be a grateful and devoted person, cared for her husband sincerely, and perhaps, over the years, her feelings for him could be called love. Despite living a life that was well planned and prosperous, she had no friends. Her only close relation was Holly, a former dormitory roommate. "You see, Holly, those who are my equals I do not need, And to those who I need, I cannot yet reach," she said frankly. "But nothing. When my boys grow up, we'll see who's going to rule who." She had high hopes for her 3 sons. They were good students, behaved decently and participated in sports, albeit with varying degrees of success. Mary was willing to make the sacrifice for her children. They were always well-dressed and provided with tutors when necessary. They regularly vacationed at the seaside, but were well aware that it would be bad for them if one of them gave a sickness and, for example, failed a quarter grade in some subject. Mary seemed to love all 3 of her sons equally, but her youngest, Norman, held a special place in her heart. He was more calm, subtle, and delicate than his older brothers. In both appearance and character, he resembled his father, yet he was simple and sincere. The usually bustling apartment became quiet and empty. During this time, Norman became especially close to his parents. "Norman is such a miracle," Mary often said to her husband, who wholeheartedly agreed. One day, Norman left training and was terribly late for his language and literature tutoring session. Despite being a native speaker, like many students, he found the subject challenging. Therefore, he began lessons with a tutor, and Mary, who managed to arrange these lessons through her connections, demanded diligence and discipline from Norman. But during training, Norman lost track of time, playing with the other boys. He realized he had less than an hour before his tutoring session. He still needed to rush home, change clothes, as he couldn't arrive at his tutor's in training attire, especially with a new tear on his knee. He made the short journey from school to home in a record 15 minutes. A glimmer of hope remained that he might make it on time. He didn't want to face a lecture from his tutor, followed by a scolding from his mother. He sped into the entrance so quickly that he nearly crashed through the front door. With giant leaps, skipping 3 steps at a time, he rushed towards his 3rd-floor apartment. On the 2nd floor, he collided with a person struggling to carry a baby carriage upstairs, wheezing loudly. In his hurry, Norman accidentally hit the stroller with his hand, triggering a loud wail from the baby inside. "Oh, I'm sorry," Norman said nonchalantly, cursing his long, flailing arms. The person with the stroller turned out to be a short, thin girl with reddish hair tied in a braid. She gave Norman a reproachful look, then bent over the crying baby. "Hush, hush, hush, Billy. Quiet, don't shout like that. What's the matter with you?" she murmured. The baby, who had been screaming at the top of his lungs, quieted down. Seeing that the girl wasn't going to berate him, Norman hurried up another flight of stairs. He glanced back and saw the girl struggling with the stroller, which seemed too large for her. The baby in it must have weighed quite a bit. She strained her whole body to drag the stroller up the stairs, clutching the handles tightly as she caught her breath. Norman glanced at his watch, realizing he would be late for class if he didn't leave the house in 5 minutes. He stared at the clock, as though attempting to add extra seconds with his gaze, before descending the stairs again. "Let me help you," he offered, grabbing the bottom of the stroller. "Hold the handles tight, got it?" He wondered in amazement as he moved the stroller. How does she manage this? "Do you live on the 4th floor?" he asked, relieved to receive a nod in response. They lived in a 4-story building, and he was grateful they didn't have to climb any further. As they hauled the stroller up the stairs, both panting heavily, he tried to remember something about the girl. All he could recall was that they moved in about a year ago, and her father was drunk too often. Upon reaching the 4th floor, Norman exhaled heavily. "Thank God! We're here. See you later." After a quick glance at his watch, he rushed back downstairs to his tutor. Despite his efforts, Norman was late and received a scolding from both his tutor and his mother. The next day, he saw the familiar stroller again, but this time it was peacefully rolling on the sidewalk, not blocking the stairs. The red-haired girl pushing it greeted Norman with a wide smile. Yesterday, late and annoyed with himself, her, and the timing. All he had noticed was the braid in her hair. Now he could see her face. She had large brown eyes with green specks, giving her a mischievous, cheerful look. Freckles were scattered across her nose, but her golden eyebrows and eyelashes were most striking, making her eyes appear brighter. For the first time in his life, Norman was observing a girl so closely. Her face was very unusual. "Thank you," she said unexpectedly. "For what?" Norman asked, taken aback. "You helped me in the entryway yesterday. You left before I could thank you," she explained. "You're welcome," he shrugged. "But it's heavy. Your baby is a big one. How do you manage to carry such a heavy stroller?" "It was difficult at first, but I've grown accustomed to it," she replied quickly, clearly happy for the conversation. "Billy is already a month and a half old. He needs to go out, and I can't leave the stroller downstairs or it might get stolen." She smiled and looked at Norman. She looked as if she weren't talking about her daily torment, but about something that gave her incredible pleasure. "Strange," thought the boy, and asked aloud, "Why don't his parents go out with him?" The smile on her face faded, as if a shadow had come over the sun. "Parents? Yeah, here," she mumbled. "Dad, he works, and Mum? We don't have a mum anymore." "Look, I'm sorry," Norman said, embarrassed, and thought to himself, "What a jerk I am. My mum told about new tenants a few weeks ago. Something happened at their house recently, but I can't remember what exactly. Listen," he said suddenly to himself, "how about you ring my doorbell when you need to get the stroller outdoor or inside? If I'm home, I'll help you." "Really?" She was taken aback. "Thank you. It's awkward, though." "Oh, no, it's more comfortable for you," he countered. "It's difficult to handle such a heavy load alone. My parents aren't home during the day, so if anyone answers the door, it's me." From then on, Lindsay would run swiftly down the stairs and gently knock on the door of Norman's apartment. If he were at home, he would appear in the doorway, and together they would take the little boy out for a walk. "I wish your Billy would go by himself," he used to say, breathing heavily. "He's getting heavier by the hour, not by the day. And what do you feed him with?" Soon he learned some details about Lindsay's life. He was staying at the entrance, attempting to pull the chain of the bicycle, when Lindsay, waving cheerfully to him, breezed past with a large household bag, apparently on her way to the store. "What a poor girl," said the elderly neighbours chatting at the entrance, watching her hurrying away. "Such a fate, you wouldn't wish it on an enemy." "What fate?" Norman lifted his head from his bicycle. "Oh, come on," said the elderly woman, waving her hands dismissively. "You're dating her, and you know nothing about your girlfriend?" "A girlfriend? Who's dating? What are you talking about?" the young man protested. All right. I was joking," the neighbour laughed. "But about Lindsay, there's no other way to put it. The girl has had a tough fate." A few minutes later, Norman was quietly and thoughtfully pedalling his bicycle, forgetting about the chain which he hadn't tightened. A few months ago, Lindsay and Billy lost their mother, who died giving birth to Billy. People had warned her, "Why do you want another child, especially with your troubled husband? You can barely take care of yourself." But she insisted that Lindsay needed a sibling. Now, Lindsay had a brother, but no mother. Their father was almost non-existent. When Sarah was alive, he was a decent man who drank moderately. Now, he was constantly intoxicated. "And now what?" Norman asked quietly. "What do you mean?" The neighbour looked at him puzzled. "What will happen to them? To Lindsay and Billy?" "What do you think will happen? Lindsay will have to play mother to her little brother." Norman was deeply moved by the story of his young neighbours. Lindsay was 2 years younger than him, a significant age gap at their age, especially between a boy and a girl. He had never really noticed the red-headed girl, who always seemed to be smiling, as though her life was full of joy. But after hearing their story, he developed an incredible respect for Lindsay. Consider him, for example. He even lazes to take his old dachshund for a walk sometimes, and he hides under the blanket until the poor dog starts shrieking pitifully. When he's hungry, he simply sits and waits for his mum to come and prepare a delicious meal. His parents cook for him, does his laundry, buys groceries and educates him. Lindsay, on the other hand, does all these things on her own, not for herself, but for her brother and father. Mary, of course, noticed her son's strange hobby. She'd seen him multiple times, grumbling under his breath, pulling the baby stroller out of the entryway, with Lindsay clinging to its handle. "I don't like this so-called friendship," she told her husband. "I simply don't like it. And why does this 5-minute orphan keep hanging around our Norman?" "Mary," exclaimed Weston, "what are you suggesting?" "What do you mean by hanging around? How could you suspect this girl of anything? Lindsay is a good girl with severe life. You know, Weston, you were a naive fool, a nerd, and you still are. It's the seemingly innocent girls who often surprise us most. They appear so pitiful, harmless and defenceless, yet they sometimes turn out to be the most dangerous." "No, Mary, that's impossible," Weston laughed. "You, like any loving mother, are even prepared to see predators in girls." Mary dismissed her husband, realizing she wouldn't find support in him. She watched her son and the neighbour girl, who suddenly seemed like a serious threat, with some anxiety. Yet Lindsay and Norman gave her no reason to worry. They greeted each other warmly and smiled in passing. Norman helped Lindsay with the baby and his transportation. He repeatedly carried the stroller and later a child's bicycle up and down the stairs, grumbling under his breath while glancing at Lindsay holding her brother. "Why do you carry him? He's bigger than you. He could carry you himself." Lindsay laughed and gently smoothed Billy's perpetually dishevelled hair. Occasionally on her way to the store, Lindsay would knock on their door. "Hey, Professor, I'm headed to the grocery shop. What do you need?" She started referring to her friend as Professor when he was engrossed in his textbooks, with final exams looming. "Oh, Lindsay, I'm scared that I'll fail everything," Norman confided. "I study and study, but nothing sticks." "Don't be ridiculous. You're smart, and you'll succeed," she reassured him, her golden eyes shining like little suns, instantly lifting his mood. After high school, like his older brothers, Norman enrolled in a university in another city. Before leaving, he met Lindsay in the yard. "Well, Lindsay, I'm leaving," he announced. "That's great," she blurted out, immediately realizing it sounded like she was happy about his departure. She quickly corrected herself. "I mean, I'll miss you. We've become good friends, but it's great for you." Lindsay held his hand and looked at him with sparkling eyes. "You'll get to see another city, meet new people, and live an entirely different life. It's wonderful. I wish I could go somewhere too. Maybe not as far, just nearby. It would be fantastic to travel and see the world." She laughed, her face bright with excitement, and suddenly Norman felt calm and reassured. Lindsay is indeed a cool girl, he thought to himself. Norman suddenly realized that Lindsay probably wouldn't be able to go on a trip anytime soon. How could she dream of seeing the world when her reality was Billy, with his perpetually dirty, torn pants, and their unshaven father, who, despite his efforts to hide it, always reeked of alcohol. Yet she maintained a cheerful disposition, genuinely rejoicing in others' happiness. Norman was consumed by his studies and his lively, fun-loving group of fellow students. For the first 2 years, during his visits home, he would occasionally run into Lindsay, who was finishing school. They would smile at each other, reminiscing about old times, and talk about everything and nothing. To Lindsay's delight, Norman would react with exaggerated shock to the sight of a grown-up Billy, and playfully grimace and rub his hand after Billy's firm handshake. A significant change occurred when Norman, after completing his second year at the university, returned home for the summer vacation. Lindsay had grown up, matured, and transformed into a young woman. Norman, now a third-year student, saw his old friend, whom he remembered with scraped hands, a scraped knee, and a neglected red braid, through new eyes. She was slender and graceful. Her features had sharpened, her freckles had faded, and her golden eyebrows and eyelashes seemed dusted with a precious powder. This gave Lindsay's gaze a shimmering depth, inviting and calling him in some mysterious way. Norman shook his head, trying to dismiss his preoccupation and recall his always busy bullet-speed friend in her old washed jeans. He surreptitiously glanced at Lindsay, who was animatedly telling a story, occasionally pulling at his arm from old habit. He replied to her, while suppressing a strong desire to touch her eyebrow with his fingertip, wondering if it would dust off gold. Lindsay looked at Norman, so grown up, serious, handsome, so familiar, and at the same time new and unfamiliar, and her heart sank sweetly, and she wanted to run her palm over his cheek. Unbeknownst to them, Mary was observing them closely from the window. 6 months later, Norman came home again and found out that Lindsay, Billy, and their father moved out. "Do you know where they have gone?" he asked. "Who knows?" his mother muttered. "Why would I care about that man and his brood?" Norman frowned at his mother's harsh words, but didn't argue. "Miss your girlfriend, do you?" Mary continued with a smirk. "Well, forget her and be grateful. We don't need such dysfunctional neighbours." "Gone?" Norman asked, confused. "And where? Do you know?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know," the mother replied firmly. "And you don't need to either. This conversation is over. I don't even want to think about them." Although Norman didn't argue with his mother, he felt that his world had become a bit duller, as if something bright and good had vanished. He realized he missed Lindsay, her infectious smile, her sincere words, and the light footsteps that would run down the stairs behind the wall. "Dad," he asked his father that evening, waiting until they were alone, "do you know where Lindsay and her family went?" "What happened? Why did they leave so suddenly?" Weston, looking much older, darkened his face and began to clean his glasses carefully with a cloth, as if buying time before his response. "Well, son," he finally said, "I honestly don't know where they are now, but I think I can tell you why they had to leave. I'm just embarrassed." "You?" Norman asked, truly surprised. His father was a kind-hearted man, gentle and inoffensive. It seemed he could not hurt or insult anyone. So what could he be ashamed of, especially in front of Lindsay's family? "You see, Norman, they had to leave because, well, our mother, Mary, always disliked them. She made them leave." "What do you mean? Make them leave?" Norman couldn't believe his ears. "How could you force a family to leave the house where they'd lived so long, where they had been happy and loved, regardless of the circumstances?" "Well, this is where the real shame begins." Weston rubbed the bridge of his nose in embarrassment. "Your mum threatened to report them to child welfare if they didn't leave, which could result in Billy being taken away from them. Also, she called their landlady and threatened her." "What?" A shocked Norman stared at his father in horror. "I couldn't believe it either." The man shook his head bitterly. "But Mary told me herself. She has long believed that Lindsay and Billy should be taken away from their father. He's an alcoholic." "So what?" shrieked the son. "He loves them, for real, and they love him. They can't be without each other. They're poor, they're strange, they're different. They may be, but they're a real family, you know." "Yes, I understand," Weston grinned. "But Mary couldn't explain it. Norman, please calm down," he said, watching his son pace the room. "Don't hold a grudge against your mum. It won't change her.
When I found out, I didn't talk to her for 3 days. But so what? He waved his hand hopelessly. Everything has already happened. Maybe it's better this way for them. Our mother has been quite harsh on Lindsay lately.
Dad, do you really not know where they moved to? Norman asked carefully.
I really don't. Believe me, if I knew, I would tell you,
replied the father, lowering his voice and glancing back into the kitchen, where his wife was making noise.
Ask our elderly neighbours. They know everything.
Hi, Mrs. Black. Norman greeted a grey-haired, hunched, but incredibly quick and agile elderly woman. Do you know where Lindsay and her family moved to?
Why do you want to know?
She looked at him with a penetrating gaze, unmistakably deducing his interest.
Did you miss Lindsay? I know their new address, but I won't give it to you.
Why? The boy asked, confused.
And she's had enough of it. She's heard enough from your mother.
The elderly woman resolutely pushed him aside, then suddenly halted and looked at him slyly.
But do you really need her?
Desperately. Norman clasped his hands to his chest.
All right. Write it down.
The woman relented.
Just don't tell your mother.
Lindsay's small family moved to the city outskirts, where old, shabby 5-story buildings huddled together as though seeking protection from the wandering wind. He climbed the grimy stairs to the 3rd floor and rang the bell. The old, worn-out door opened, and he saw Lindsay. "Lindsay, my darling!" he blurted out. He was so overjoyed to see her that he didn't notice how her usually radiant face had changed. She looked at him blankly and said, "Well, hello," while keeping the door slightly ajar and blocking his entry into the apartment. "Lindsay, I'm so happy to see you," Norman exclaimed, barely resisting the urge to sweep her into his arms. "Happy? What exactly are you so happy about?" she asked in a soft, mocking tone, a tone he had never heard from her before. "Lindsay, why are you speaking like that?" Norman asked, confused. "Nothing. You came for nothing. There's nothing to be particularly happy about here." She lowered her eyes, but immediately looked at him resolutely. "Go away, Norman." "Lindsay, dear, listen to me, please." He tried to take her hand, but she pushed it away. "I know everything. My mother, she's wrong." "Wrong," Lindsay responded ironically. "Lindsay, I can't speak ill of my mother. What she did was unfair, mean, but Listen," the girl interrupted him. "Your mother's a piece of work. She has nothing to do with this, okay? You shouldn't be here, because I don't want you here. That's it, you know?" Norman shook his head, confused. "Oh, how stupid you are! I don't need you. Just go away. What makes you think I'm waiting for you? And anyway, I'm getting married," she said, loudly and angrily. Norman looked at Lindsay. Her eyebrows and eyelashes, which had always been golden, now seemed almost black to him. "Getting married?" Norman repeated dully. "Yes. Are you surprised? Do you think I couldn't manage without you? As you can see, I've already settled down quite successfully. So, happiness to you, Norman. Now, goodbye." The door slammed shut. Norman never saw Lindsay again. After graduating from the university, Norman continued to live and work in the same city. He had relationships with women and experienced breakups. He tried a couple of times to start a family, but it never worked out. His relationship with his parents had fallen apart after what happened. More precisely, he continued to call his father and see him every chance he got. But his mother, after he demanded an explanation from her, was insulted.
"Mum, how could you do that?"
her son asked loudly. I did what I thought was right, she said bluntly and openly, with full conviction. She looked at her son. I was saving you. Saving me? From what? From the girl I love? From happiness? From light? Norman replied with a smile. No, the woman replied firmly. From poverty. From a family of alcoholics who would be a burden on you. From yourself. You were such a fool, and she didn't seem to grieve for you long, if at all. Doesn't that prove my point? You must have found her, right?
I know, I did. I couldn't help it.
So? She sent you away. I knew it. He looked at his mother. His heart was full of pity, but he couldn't figure out who he felt more sorry for. Lindsay, his mother, himself. After the move, Lindsay settled into the 2-room apartment, where the walls were painted dark green, and the toilet had an old shabby cistern with a dangling chain that could hardly be called new. The father, who had started drinking after his wife's death, had gradually become an alcoholic. He drank alone, quietly and secretly from his children. A calm, very modest man with kind eyes, he tried his best to look decent, despite his trembling hands and tired eyes. He worked at an auto repair shop and had once been an excellent mechanic. After all that had happened, his colleagues pitied him and didn't terminate his employment, but he was no longer allowed to do any serious work, only cleaning. Although from time to time his former co-workers would sometimes ask him, Ben, look, huh? What do you think it is? Ben would glance around to ensure none of his superiors were present. Then he would gaze fondly at the disassembled car. At home, he would look at his children with remorseful eyes and promise himself not to drink again. As twilight fell outside the window, his beloved Sarah would appear, sitting across from him, causing a deep ache in his heart. He would bear the pain as long as he could, before taking a drink to ease it slightly. This was their life. Lindsay was studying at nursing school, working night shifts at the hospital, while Billy attended school. Then, one day, the doorbell rang, and Norman's mother was at the threshold. God, what more do you want from us? Lindsay said wearily. I want you to give up Norman, Mary said bluntly and resolutely. Give up Norman? Do I have him? Lindsay asked, surprised. Don't play the fool. I've been observing you for a while. You're a cunning and crafty young woman, but I won't let you ruin my son's life, Mary retorted. Lindsay narrowed her eyes, attempting to comprehend what this woman required of her. My son will surely run to you. I'm not naive enough to think he'll just move on. So, I want you to reject him, definitively and irrevocably, so he won't hold on to any hope. Do you understand? Mary's voice was filled with fury. And if he doesn't step away? Lindsay leaned against the door jamb. And if not, I'll ensure that your dear daddy loses his job. He will be ousted, I promise you that, and he won't find work anywhere else in this town. No one will even trust him with a broom. They'll take your Billy away from you too, to the orphanage. You're studying. Your father is unemployed. How much chance do you think you have? Believe me, I'll do it. You know me. Yes, I know you, agreed Lindsay. Mary was accurate in her predictions. Norman found them and instantly rushed over. Lindsay looked at him with difficulty, spat out angry, dreadful words that made her jaw tense, but silently prayed, Please don't believe me. Don't listen to me. Can't you see I'm not myself? I love you. It's so clear. It simply cannot be otherwise. But Norman didn't hear this desperate, silent prayer and left, giving her a farewell look that left her unsettled for a long time. She couldn't bear to look at herself in the mirror for a while after that. It was nauseating. Lindsay graduated from nursing school, got married, and had a daughter named Emily. There wasn't much familial happiness. They turned out to be strangers who happened to be close to each other. Soon, having no special feelings for one another, they parted easily and simply, without mutual regrets or claims. A few years later, Lindsay's father passed away as peacefully as he had lived. Billy enrolled in a cadet school where he spent most of his time. Lindsay worked as a nurse in a hospital and occasionally brought Emily along for her night shifts when there was no one else to look after the 4-year-old. Emily always sat quietly in a corner of the nurse's room, waiting until Lindsay was preoccupied before sneaking out to explore. During one of these excursions, Emily wandered into a ward where a pale, sad-looking man lay alone. The man himself didn't interest her, but the large, enticing orange on his bedside table did. The man didn't offer her the fruit, so she had to engage him in conversation, despite her mother's instructions not to talk to the patients or leave the nurse's room. Finally, the man guessed to give the child a treat. Emily grabbed her lute and suddenly heard quick footsteps along the corridor. Naturally, it was her mother, who was probably angry. Emily prepared herself for the inevitable disappointment. No park visit over the weekend, and no ice cream. But something strange happened. Mum froze, opened and closed her mouth funny, as if she wanted to say something and forgot what. And suddenly, she smiled, and then cried. The main thing was that she had obviously forgotten to scold Emily. Norman and Lindsay were shocked, taken aback by an unexpected encounter they had never anticipated. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Norman tried to speak several times, but the words wouldn't come out. He wanted to tell her how he had only dreamt of her all these years, how his efforts to build a personal life had been in vain, all because he couldn't forget her. He wanted to explain why he had foolishly allowed his mother to convince him to leave. He wanted to know about her life and where little Emily came from. But suddenly, none of it seemed to matter anymore. The most important thing was that she was here with him now, smiling at him, just as she used to when they were younger. Lindsay, too, wanted to explain to him why she had given up, how she hated herself for her cowardice, for letting his mother intimidate and confuse her, for abandoning him, the man she loved, the man she cared for. She had paid dearly for this. If not for Emily, who knows what would have become of her? But she realized that there was no need to drag Norman through the gloomy past again. The important thing was that he was here, now, next to her, holding her hand as tightly as he once had held her little brother's stroller. Knowing he couldn't yet speak about her or himself, Norman chose a different topic. Lindsay, be honest. Does Emily have some superpowers? I felt something peculiar when she was in my room. I was lying down feeling awful, and then Emily came in and touched my fingers. It felt like a wave washed over me. Oh, Norman, don't be silly, Lindsay chuckled. What superpowers? Emily is a normal child. You imagined it yourself. You were scared, lost, alone with your sickness. Then, suddenly, there was another living being with you. You felt human warmth, and it made a difference. That's a simple explanation, Norman agreed. But your Emily is still wonderful because she led you to me. And you know, Lindsay, I've been waiting for you all my life. Just you. You're lying, she laughed, the same laugh he had yearned to hear for so many years. Life doesn't work like that. It does, Norman said, and felt that everything would be all right now. Slowly but surely, Norman was recovering. Shortly after his discharge, he proposed to Lindsay, and the woman agreed. Yes, it happens in life that life separates us from those who are meant for us. But there is always a chance to meet again and start from the beginning.